They operate in strictest secrecy at the cutting edge of Australia's defence. They're creative, unorthodox, and comfortable in chaos. For over 50 years, the Australian SAS has put their lives at risk, deep in enemy territory. This is the only television history ever supported by this highly secretive regiment. We take you beyond the stereotypes to reveal the unexpected story of the real people who set out to transform SAS from the ugly duckling of the Australian Army into Australia's force of first choice. In the early 1960s, SAS began counterinsurgency training for Borneo in the jungles of Papua New Guinea. Indonesia had announced Konfrontasi, its undeclared war against the new Federation of Malaysia. In late 1964, Malaysia appealed to Australia for troops. About to introduce conscription for Vietnam, Prime Minister Menzies agreed, and one squadron SAS joined Australian forces moving to Sarawak in Borneo to help seal the border against Indonesian killer patrols. SAS was finally on active service.
It was a secret affair. Our families, loved ones, etc. had very little knowledge of exactly where we were.
At the time of deployment, none of us in the squadron had any idea what we were going to be doing there, where we were going to be doing it, and how we were going to be doing it.
Konfrontasi began with poorly trained irregulars crossing the border from Kalimantan in savage attacks on outposts in Sabah and Sarawak. These irregulars were reinforced by tough, no-nonsense Indonesian Marines and trained as killer patrols. The border war intensified. By this time, Army headquarters had given the new regiment genuine Special Forces tasks. SAS would monitor potentially hostile forces in Southeast Asia and New Guinea, using surveillance and hearts and minds intelligence operations among indigenous peoples. SAS could create and lead indigenous irregular forces, ambush and weaken large enemy forces, and interrupt their supply lines. To protect their operational security, SAS became enclosed and cagey, keeping their operations secret from the rest of the army. But this secrecy didn't help their reputation with those they most needed to impress in Canberra.
There were still some people in Army headquarters in Canberra who were worried that the SAS were a bunch of cowboys going off out of control and doing things that we shouldn't do, and because this was the first time SAS had been deployed in operations. Unfortunately, this feeling of uncertainty about SAS lasted well into the SAS commitment into Vietnam.
On one squadron's arrival in Brunei, the experienced British 22 SAS taught them counterinsurgency tactics based on smaller four-man patrols. But the Australians rejected the British doctrine of saving a patrol by leaving its wounded behind.
The Brit system operating on four-man patrols was one of shoot and scoot. It was very strongly advocated by the Australian patrols when they took over from the 22, is that whatever happened, if a man was wounded, that the patrol would come back and get him.
The task of the British commander in Borneo, General Sir Walter Walker, was difficult. He had to seal the jungle border and defeat the killer patrols, while at all costs avoiding the political nightmare of all-out war. Although this sensitive task was ideal for SAS, Walker was initially not sure what to do with SAS troops. 40 years later, SAS would experience this same frustration when it arrived to fight Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. At first, Walker wanted SAS to jump in as paratroopers to retake villages captured by the Indonesians. But Britain's 22 SAS persuaded Walker to use SAS strategically as pathfinders to detect Indonesian troops crossing the 1,100-kilometre border and to locate their bases in Kalimantan for infantry attack. Additional intelligence would come from vital hearts and minds operations among the local border tribes. Outside the towns, there were no roads, and to avoid tracks, patrols cross-grained through thick jungles, up high, steep ridges, and across wide, fast rivers.
Personally, I found Borneo an absolutely beautiful country. It was still virgin. There were very few roads at all, except in the Kuching city itself. But the outskirts, the mountains, etc., it was a truly lovely country, one that I'd certainly like to go and tour again before it becomes industrial.
At twilight time and night time, it was very daunting, very eerie. Even during the day, the sunlight's just coming through the canopy in shafts, and when there's no sound, there's no birds to sing in, you think, what's going on, what's wrong? You have to be adaptable, you have to have a character that will accept that.
SAS patrols often lasted 14 arduous days. There was no resupply. Each man had to carry with him 14 days' worth of food. But when Indonesian raids increased, General Walker took a gamble. He decided to send SAS patrols over the border in covert operations to locate the raiders. These were called the Claret operations, highly secret, totally deniable, and very dangerous. An SAS patrol caught on the Kalimantan side of the border would be denounced as neo-colonialist invaders. So Claret operations rules for SAS patrols were severe. No dog tags to be worn, body waste to be wrapped in polythene to suppress the smell, no one to be captured, dead or alive, and anyone caught would be disowned by his government. With no roads, Claret patrols flew inland to a remote border outpost from which the patrol hiked to begin its dangerous cross-border mission.
But during the Borneo patrols, the bushcraft skills were something that we really had to concentrate on, where the infantry skills are somewhat different, where we were given maps that sort of went up to a border, and across the border where we used to cross over, it was just a blank sheet of paper.
There were no contour lines, any hills or high features were marked by hachures, and the only way we could overcome this problem was one of bearings and paces. Paces we got from using sheep counters.
So our navigating skills had to be really extreme. And of course the mountains and the environment we're in, that we just had nothing to work off. So we had to make our maps as we were going, and it was quite a challenge.
And of course the main navigation was one of using the major rivers. And this has of course been a mainstay in Southeast Asia ever since. But it was difficult and quite frustrating at many times.
The Indons that were onto us, we stopped, listened, see if they were following, and yes, they were following. There's a bit of a murmuring and a bit of rustling. So off we went again, and quietly, silently, stopped again, had to listen, off again. And we kept doing this until we had a young officer who'd had just done his selection course prior to coming to Borneo with us, and he looked at the patrol commander when we stopped this particular time, and he says, Sergeant, he says, why are we running? We're SAS. And the patrol commander looked at him and he said, it may have escaped your attention, Lieutenant, but there's 6 of us and there's 25 to 30 of them.
At this time, we were receiving very heavy fire from the village. The main group pulled out, not realising I was left behind because I was a bit hurt, and with the 2 SAS boys. When we realised they'd gone, we went a little bit silly and decided to charge this post, but behind us, 12.7 machine gun opened up from up the hill behind us, so we regained our senses straight away with alacrity, and we took off.
Because of the high country and the actually radios we were using, basically Second World War stuff, the rains, dampness, the radio operators, what they had to do was pull their sets apart and find an opening in the canopy where we'd get a bit of sun on the radios to dry them out before we could actually make contact.
We were within 50 metres or so of the camp when we were sprung by an Indonesian platoon. I never put a set back together in such a short time. They then mortared us to our immediate front, and we ran through that unscathed and headed back to the border with the enemy in hot pursuit. And it wasn't long before we could pick up exactly what they were doing. Stop for a brew would be 3 whistles, so we would stop for a brew too. It was rather like a travelling circus, and they were always the same distance behind us. I withdrew my hand grenade from my shoulder pouch and we put it across our tracks with a piece of fishing line tied to a bush. Some 5 minutes later, there was a huge explosion, accompanied by much screaming and blowing of whistles, and we realised then that we'd managed to get the hunters off our back.
There were many discussions as to which was the most important skill, and it was brought down, I think, to 2 skills. Certainly the one of the one shot, one kill, and the ability to navigate. Without a doubt, Borneo brought home the most important skill is the one of being able to accurately navigate and know where you are, and more importantly, where the enemy are.
The jungles in Sarawak, we found, were extremely dark and dense, and a huge plethora of wildlife existed there, such as wild pigs, snakes of all descriptions, orangutans, wild elephants. And it was an extremely inhospitable area to be in.
And as the night set in, I heard this roar in the jungle and I wondered to myself, what the hell was that? A little bit later, there was a lot of rustling and another roar. And at this stage, I reached down and grabbed my rifle. Within seconds, the side of my poncho was pushed open, and this ugly-looking thing was right on top of me and let out a hell of a scream. And I say it had a breath on it like Satan's bottom. As I knew we were in a very severe tactical situation and didn't want to compromise the patrol, I can remember saying to Shorty Turner, who was the patrol commander, in a hushed voice, "What do you want me to do, shoot it or stab it?" I was a bit embarrassed about this all as the orangutan took off. But it was only later that I heard the safety catches on the more distinctive SLRs go back onto safe that I realised that they were going to shoot it anyway, whatever it was. It wasn't until the next morning that I asked them what they were going to do, and after a while they said back to me, "We were going to shoot you and it."
We were returning from one patrol there in Borneo. Very rough terrain, razorback ridges. A shout came from the rear of the patrol that there was an elephant pad track still oozing water. In other words, the elephant was still in a close vicinity. And the elephant took off up the track. Well, as he went past me, I fired a shot, as I hoped to be in the back of his ear. It didn't stop him. Brushed by me, and I went down the side of the cliff. The other three members got off the track to the right and tried to get behind this big log. The first two members got across, but the SIG, he just couldn't make it, being loaded down with his set and his own gear and etc. Made it halfway across the log when the elephant gored him.
In early 1966, President Sukarno was deposed by Army General Suharto. Confrontasi wound down and hostilities ceased. But SAS, on the watch for leftover guerrilla units, carried out hearts and minds operations with the local border tribes.
To do that, we would help them with their health problems, and we had some really significant results there. Perhaps help deliver children, try and do something about the hygiene in the village, which was pretty ghastly, and try and get over what was a fairly high child mortality rate.
They had a child there that had somehow stabbed itself in the crutch area. Gangrene had actually set in. And so as patrol medics, we attended to the problem. And funnily enough, the child actually stopped crying once it received the treatment. And we called in a helicopter and got the mother and the child out.
We got along pretty well with a mixture of language and joking with one another, and it was quite often that we would they would come up and stick their foot alongside ours and make fun of us having big feet, and we would sort of then make fun of them having rings through their ears, which they're very fond of having.
The teeth would be a lot generally rotten because of betel nut. We would get the tooth out, and then the patient would be given a short course of tetracycline, which was the new wonder drug in the 60s, in order to stop any infection.
But at the same time, we were sort of plying them with questions about what was happening on the other side of the border. Now, the border is something that's drawn by Caucasians and put on maps and means absolutely nothing to these hunters.
Look, I think Borneo was a classic SAS surveillance operation. Long-range patrols, sometimes across the border, reporting back what you saw, harassing the enemy.
SAS operations in Borneo were a success. But because they remained top secret, the army at large continued to mock SAS as super soldiers or glamour boys. SAS's own secrecy was working against them. From sheer ignorance, the army might in future squander proven SAS talents. In Vietnam, that risk would become reality. When Communist North Vietnam began attacks against South Vietnam, America assumed the domino theory was coming true and intervened in 1964. But by 1966, even with American support, South Vietnam was losing the war to Mao Zedong's first and second phases of revolutionary war, terrorism and guerrilla tactics, which neither the American commanders nor the colonial French generals before them really understood. American strategy was geared only to Mao Zedong's final revolutionary phase, conventional warfare, where America's vast Cold War arsenal would destroy the Viet Cong divisions en masse. But the elusive VC fought as guerrillas, farmers by day, fighters by night. To defeat the VC guerrilla units, SAS-style counter-insurgency tactics were needed. In June 1966, Australia, keen to keep America in Asia, sent a small task force to Vietnam. The Australian mission was to pacify Phuoc Tuy province, a communist stronghold east of Saigon. 3 Squadron SAS were in action for the first time.
In 1966, we were flying in the Qantas charter to Saigon. Just prior to landing, the captain came on the radio and said, "Gentlemen, welcome to Saigon. The outside temperature is 30 degrees, and gunfire on the ground is light to moderate."
Phuoc Tuy province, with its monsoonal jungle hiding VC guerrilla units, was a very dangerous place to be. The task force boldly set up camp in a rubber plantation at Nui Dat, disrupting a major VC supply route. They declared a large area off limits to all Vietnamese, enforced by round-the-clock fighting patrols. The Australians faced a formidable jungle enemy. The Vietnamese were cunning, hardy and aggressive warriors, experts at guerrilla warfare, fighting on their own ground against the invaders.
I might add that they were fearless fighters and very brave fighters, and one never ever took the attitude that they were inferior to us.
After centuries of occupation, the Vietnamese had expelled the Chinese. They'd driven out Japanese invaders in World War II, and they defeated the French colonial empire in Indochina in the 1950s. The Viet Cong were basically a low-technology army, improvising simple but effective tricks. Although well-equipped by Russia, they ingeniously recycled American war waste.
One particular exercise we did, we found a grenade-making factory. What they used to do is they used to find old smoke grenade canisters, which burns the centre out, and they'd fill them with explosives and turn them into a grenade.
The VC could even cope with the dreaded American B-52 bombing strikes.
A B-52 raid can be compared to the next step down from an atom bomb being used. The Viet Cong and the NVA had a medium by which the only way you would survive was to put your finger in your ears and keep screaming at the top of your voice to prevent your lungs being ruptured or collapsed by the blast.
To conceal their losses, the VC also removed their dead and wounded after battle. Communist forces in Phuoc Tuy outnumbered the Australians 4-1. The VC controlled much of the population through intimidation, insistent pro-communist ideological education, and anti-American Vietnamese nationalism. For the VC were fighting a people's war, where civilian and soldier, peasant and politician were often one and the same Viet Cong. At the outset, there was a problem with how best to use the SAS squadron. As in Borneo, the army commanders were unsure. Some thought that SAS troops should be split up and used as conventional infantry. But the SAS squadron commander, Major John Murphy, won for SAS its ideal role in strategic reconnaissance, watching the task force's back and locating VC units for infantry attack. Yet the strategic ability of SAS to shape the outcomes of campaigns would continue to escape senior commanders. SAS would have to fight not only the ferocious Viet Cong, but also a state of mind, a political culture, an embedded alien ideology. For SAS, fighting the People's War would require classic counter-revolutionary warfare tactics. All terrorist and guerrilla forces need a sanctuary, a haven safe from the enemy. For the VC, the jungle was their sanctuary, and the support of the people was their centre of gravity.
The centre of gravity is that part of the adversary's architecture and edifice which, if you attack it and destroy it, brings the whole edifice to the ground. Now, as an example, for a Western democracy like Australia that needs to conduct military operations in the 21st century, our centre of gravity is always the will of the people, and that must be protected at all times.
Small five-man SAS patrols promptly moved into the thick jungle, going far beyond the protection of task force artillery. SAS quickly located hundreds of VC using the jungle tracks. One SAS trooper said, there were so many VC on the move, they needed traffic lights. SAS strategy was to make the jungle unsafe for the VC. SAS would use guerrilla tactics against the guerrillas themselves. If their tiny teams could damage the mighty VC infrastructure, SAS could expose communist forces to task force attack and break their hold on the population. The coming grim contest between SAS and VC would pit David against Goliath.